Okay, let's just jump right in. We're about to do a deep dive into one of the most, just one of the most complex and long-running histories in the world.
It's an absolutely epic story.
Yeah, we're essentially taking a shortcut through 40,000 years of resilience, of conflict, and just incredible transformation. This is the history of Vietnam.
And, for most people, the story starts and ends with the conflicts of the 20th century.
Exactly. But it is so much longer, so much more layered than that.
That's absolutely right. Our mission today is to give you the full picture, the ultimate deep dive, a really detailed chronological account.
From the very beginning.
From the very, very beginning, from the first hunter-gatherers right up to its modern status as a middle-income economy. We're covering the entire arc. We're not skipping the 1,000 years of domination, the dynastic golden ages, or, the huge ideological shifts of the modern era.
And we really do mean the beginning. We're starting way back in prehistory. The very first inhabitants we know of, these ancient East Eurasian hunter-gatherers, they showed up at least 40,000 years ago.
40,000, it's deep human history. It sets the entire ecological stage for everything that comes after.
It really does. But the culture that, I guess, lays the foundation for what we think of as Vietnamese civilization, that comes much, much later.
So you're talking about the Neolithic period, so roughly 4,000 years ago.
And this is where the whole demographic landscape just changes completely. About 4 millennia back, you start to see these migrations of ancient Southern East Asian populations.
Mainly Austroasiatic and Austronesian peoples.
And they're coming down from what's now southern China, moving into Southeast Asia.
And this isn't just a small migration. It's transformative. It's an absolute game changer.
Why is that? What are they bringing with them?
They're bringing the one piece of knowledge that will define the next 2,000 years of history in the region. Wet rice cultivation.
The foundation of everything.
It's everything. It gives you the economic basis for settled life, for one. It allows for the population density you need to even start thinking about forming a state. And, genetically and linguistically, this is the bedrock of the modern Vietnamese people.
Okay, so let's move into part one, which we're calling Ancient Foundations and the 1,000 Years of Domination. We'll trace this from prehistory all the way up to that huge victory in 938 AD.
It really kicks off with the emergence of these powerful indigenous chiefdoms during the first millennium BCE.
And this era is really embodied by the Ung Sun culture, right? Centered in the Red River Delta.
Exactly. The Ung Sun culture is what many people point to as the original core of a distinct Vietnamese political identity. They had advanced political organization, and their technology was incredibly sophisticated for the time.
The bronze drums.
The famous Ung Sun drums, yeah. They were masters of bronze casting. And these drums weren't just musical instruments. They were status symbols. They were ritual objects. They were major artistic achievements all rolled into one.
And the whole culture was built around that one core activity.
Rice cultivation. It supported everything. It allowed that slow transition from scattered tribes into these really structured indigenous chiefdoms, like Van Lang and Alok.
And now we step into the world of myth a little bit. The legendary Hung Bang Dynasty. It's said to have ruled until about 258 BC. What's the political importance of these origin stories?
Oh, it's immense. The sources we have show that later Vietnamese elites, especially around the 15th century, made a conscious effort to collect and codify these stories.
To what end? What were they trying to do?
They were trying to build a nation, to establish a deep, almost semi-divine lineage for Vietnam that was distinct from, but also connected to, the major powers around them.
And that's why the founder Luk Turk is recorded as a descendant of the mythical Chinese ruler Shennong.
Precisely. It cleverly links Vietnam to the broader regional culture, to China, while at the same time asserting a unique indigenous line of succession. It's classic nation-building mythology. It legitimizes your rule and creates a shared identity.
So that sort of sets the stage for the, let's say, slightly more concrete Thuc dynasty, founded by a figure named Guk Phan, who ruled from 257 to 179 BC.
And this period is critical because it introduces a theme that we're going to see over and over again.
Which is?
External regional influence playing a role in leading the state. Thuc Phan himself wasn't from the Red River Delta. He was from Sichuan, the ancient Chinese state of Shu.
But he establishes his capital at a place that becomes a true indigenous marvel, called Citadel.
Koloa wasn't just big, it was an absolute feat of military engineering. The sources describe this complex, spiraling structure, a maze of walls and moats.
You can't build something like that without a very organized state behind you.
Absolutely not. It required advanced planning, central control, a real command of construction, engineering, military arts. It's the proof that a structured, powerful early Vietnamese state was truly emerging.
Okay, so after Koloa, we get the Trieu dynasty from 204 to 111 BC, and the founder here is Zhao Tuo, a military commander from the Chinese Qin dynasty.
Right. And this is where the historical lens gets, well, it gets messy. The line between what's internal rule and what's foreign domination starts to get really blurry.
How so?
Well, it's a crucial point for understanding how Vietnam tells its own story. For centuries, traditional Vietnamese historians actually saw the Trieu dynasty as an orthodox, legitimate, local regime. They listed them right alongside other Vietnamese rulers.
But that's not the view anymore.
Not at all. Modern historians have completely shifted that perspective. They generally see the Trieu dynasty as a foreign regime.
And why does that reclassification matter so much for the national identity today?
Because of what comes next. The 1,000 years of Chinese domination. Modern Vietnamese history wants to draw a very clear line in the sand. Who was a sovereign ruler and who was a colonizer?
So by classifying Zhao Tuo, who was a Qin military governor, as a foreign ruler,
You extend that period of resistance backward in time. It reinforces this powerful narrative of a continuous struggle against foreign intervention, and it makes that final victory for independence in the 10th century seem even more profound.
which sets a very grim stage for what comes next. The monumentally challenging eras of Chinese domination, kicking off in 111 BC and running all the way through to 938 AD.
The first period of domination began with the Han Conquest in 111 BC and lasted until 40 AD. They imposed their imperial administration, their taxes, their culture.
But they also imposed the tradition of resistance.
Immediately. The most famous response to this is, of course, the Trung Sisters Rebellion from 40 to 43 AD.
It's a seminal moment. Even though it was ultimately crushed, it became this almost sacred story of early Vietnamese patriotism and, importantly, of female military leadership.
But its defeat ushered in the Second Chinese domination from 43 to 544 AD. And what's fascinating here is how complex the dynamics of imperial rule actually were during this long stretch.
It wasn't always just a simple case of Vietnamese versus Han Chinese.
Not at all. The sources suggest that some of the successful resistance movements, or the de facto independent states that popped up when an imperial dynasty was in decline, were sometimes led by local elite families who were themselves of Han or Han Viet descent. They had deep ties to the imperial system.
So it's less about pure ethnic independence and more about political opportunism.
I think that's a big part of it. It suggests that opposition was often driven by a desire to protect their own local elite status when the central Han authority was weak, not necessarily by a unified movement seeking a permanent national break from China as a whole.
And that element of elite opportunism is definitely a factor in the rise of Li Bon. He gives the Vietnamese a temporary taste of sovereignty with the State of Van Xuan.
Right, from 544 to 602 AD. And Li Bon, or Li Nam as he was called, was a local elite. He was descended from northern migrants who had settled in the area centuries earlier.
And his rebellion wasn't, at least at first, purely ideological.
No, the sources say the spark was actually personal disappointment. The hyper-elitist Liang court in the south rejected him and his friends for high official positions. They basically treated them like uncultured provincials.
So being snubbed by the court drove him to create his own court.
Essentially, yes. That slight being told you're not good enough drove him to declare himself the Southern Emperor and establish Van Xuan in 544 right after he defeated a Liang punitive army.
But the geopolitical situation changes pretty dramatically.
It does. The powerful Sui dynasty comes along and conquers the Liang successor state in 589. And Li Fit, who was Li Bon's successor, he tries to appease the Sui. He recognizes their authority.
But it was just a tactic.
A purely tactical move. When he eventually rebels, the Sui general Lu Thang marches south and basically forces his surrender in 602. That's the end of Van Xuan.
And the beginning of the Third Chinese domination.
That's the one. It runs from 602 all the way to 938, with only a brief interruption by the Wuzhou period. This entire 1,000-year period really becomes the forge for Vietnamese identity. It's defined by this constant psychological burden and the strategic necessity of resistance.
And all of that pressure, all that tension, it culminates in one magnificent defining moment.
The Battle of Bach in 938.
You really can't overstate the importance of this battle.
You can't. Gogukien engineered a victory that wasn't just a military win. It was the final, definitive blow that ended a millennium of direct Chinese imperial domination. It paved the way for the very first truly independent and lasting Vietnamese state. The long struggle was over, and self-rule could finally begin.
So with the Chinese finally expelled, we move into part two, the dynastic Golden Age expansion and internal strife. This charts the birth of true Vietnamese sovereignty from 939 right up to 1802.
Goguen immediately sets up his capital at Ko Loa in 939, and that's a very deliberate choice.
He's consciously reviving the spirit of that ancient indigenous Thuc dynasty.
Exactly. It marks the official start of self-sovereignty.
But, immediate stability it was fleeting. Nungo Kien dies suddenly in 944, and the country just implodes.
Total chaos. The anarchy of the 12 warlords from 965 to 968, it just shows how fragile that newfound independence was without a strong central figure to hold it all together.
And Dinh Lin was that strong man.
He was the one. He unifies the country in 967, renames it Iko Viet, and establishes the capital at Ho Lo. And what's really interesting is that his early administration relied heavily on Buddhist monks as advisors.
Which suggests what?
It suggests that Buddhism held immense cultural and political power right after the end of Chinese Confucian dominance. It was the alternative power structure.
Then we get the Anterior Lei dynasty from 980 to 109. And the sources point to this fascinating political move by the founder, Lei Hongwan.
Ah, yes. He solidifies his power by marrying Duong Van Ga,
who was the former empress consort of Dinh Lin. That's a very fluid, almost Shakespearean way to secure legitimacy through a dynastic marriage.
It speaks to the practical nature of state building after so much war. But the real institutional and cultural flourishing, that happens under the later Li dynasty from 1009 to 1225.
This is what you'd call the golden age of Vietnamese civilization.
Without a doubt. A key part of that was the establishment of the nation's first university, the Temple of Literature, or Van Mio, in 1070.
Which was for Confucian education, ironically.
Right, which shows they understood the necessity of using Chinese administrative techniques to run a state.
Oh.
But Van Mio was uniquely Vietnamese. It wasn't just a carbon copy of a Chinese academy.
How so?
The temple grounds were built to house distinctly local elements. You had carvings of local plants and animals, Buddhist symbols right alongside the Confucian ones. It shows that even while they were importing this model of governance, the culture was rapidly synthesizing it into something new, something indigenous.
And economically, the late emperors were absolutely foundational, especially in the all-important Red River Delta.
They understood the fundamental challenge of the delta, which is flood control. They systematically built these massive flood control dikes, which protected the agricultural base and created the stability needed for everything else: political growth, cultural growth.
And speaking of culture, this was the absolute peak of Buddhism's political power.
It was at its zenith. Buddhism had massive influence. Kings consulted monks on state policy, pagodas were granted huge privileges, owning vast tax-exempt lands that were worked by serfs.
There's that story about Queen Huailan.
Yes. The sources say she was accused of ordering the assassination of a rival. And to redeem herself, to purify her karma, she spent the rest of her life funding the construction of 100 pagodas. It just shows how deeply intertwined spiritual life was with the power of the state.
But as the Li dynasty gives way to the Trung dynasty from 1225 to 1400, Vietnamese sovereignty faces maybe its greatest challenge ever.
The Mongol Empire.
The Trung dynasty is, and rightly so, famous for what they did.
They defeated the Mongols, the incredibly powerful Yuan dynasty of Kublai Khan, in 3 separate comprehensive campaigns. This is just a staggering achievement in world history. It proves that the Vietnamese state had developed military and political systems capable of beating the world's foremost military power.
Let's focus on the 1285 campaign led by Kublai Khan's son, Togen. The Mongols were meticulous this time around.
Oh, they had learned from their last failure. Togen's army was highly organized. They set up a boatyard for river transport. They established supply posts every 15 kilometers, all the way from the Chinese border to the capital, Tung Long.
They were planning for a long, sustained occupation. This wasn't just a raid.
Absolutely not. So the question is, how did the Vietnamese commander, the brilliant Tran Hun Ao, break that sophisticated supply chain? You can't just meet them head on.
So what was his strategy?
Tran Hun understood that the key to the Mongol army wasn't its warriors, it was its stomach. It was the supply chain. His genius was immobilizing the nation's internal resources.
He activated the private armies stationed on the royal prince's massive farm estates, the Intrek.
Exactly. These private forces formed an inner defensive line. They attacked behind Togen's main army, relentlessly smashing those logistical posts, cutting the supply lines, and essentially starving the invaders out.
It was a brilliant use of decentralized power to attack the very source of Mongol strength, and their diplomatic strategy after the war was just as clever.
The emperor at home, king abroad policy.
What was the political thinking there?
It was pure strategic pragmatism. At home, to their own people, the Tren emperors were Homang Oregan, full, undeniable sovereignty.
But when they wrote to Kublai Khan,
They adopted the lower title of Voan King. They performed all these acts of public humility, sent gifts, made up elaborate excuses for why they couldn't possibly travel to the Yuan court to pay homage in person.
so they were giving the Mongol emperor just enough to soothe his pride and avoid another invasion.
While maintaining absolute functional independence at home, it is a masterclass in diplomacy under extreme pressure.
And while they were balancing this threat from the north, they were also dealing with threats from the south.
Right, the Champa Kingdom under King Pobedonosor had this dramatic resurgence. He ransacked Hanoi multiple times, and by the 1380s came very close to uniting all of Vietnam under his rule.
And his ambition ended in 1390 when he was killed in a naval battle.
Killed specifically by sophisticated Vietnamese firearm units, which is a little detail that tells you a lot about the evolving military technology of the Vietnamese state.
This brings us to a period of really intense cultural and political disruption, the brief Ho dynasty from 1400 to 1407.
And their biggest move was this attempt at profound linguistic independence. They abolished Chinese as the official script and made Chinom, that system of modified Chinese characters for writing vernacular Vietnamese, the official language of the state.
A very bold assertion of indigenous culture.
So bold that it triggered a catastrophic reaction.
Yeah.
The fourth Chinese domination under the Ming from 1407 to 1428. And this occupation was characterized by just brutal cultural repression.
They didn't just occupy, they tried to erase.
A wholesale destruction and removal of Vietnamese texts, printing blocks. It was an attempt at cultural erasure. That loss of historical knowledge, of tradition, must have created this profound national trauma.
Which would have fueled the next liberation movement.
It absolutely did. The trauma was so deep that the movement that followed, led by Lê Louis, wasn't just about winning a military victory. It was about national and cultural restoration.
And Lê Louis' campaign, which started in 1418 from Lamson Mountain, it was this masterful 10-year-long effort. It required incredible patience.
It was defined by patient guerrilla warfare. He just avoided direct fights with the superior Ming forces. He let them exhaust their resources, wear themselves out against an enemy they could never quite pin down, until they were so tired they were ready to negotiate a withdrawal.
This ushers in the later Lê dynasty, which really hits its peak under Lê Thanh Tong from 1449 to 1497. He's widely seen as one of the most talented feudal leaders in all of Vietnamese history.
A true Renaissance ruler. He established immense stability, a sophisticated legal and economic system. He focused on agriculture, improving farming, encouraging the use of new land, and he issued the Hung Legal Code.
Which systematized Vietnamese law.
Yes, and it reinforced the state's central power, but it also had these unique protections, like certain rights for women in land ownership and inheritance, which made it distinct from a purely Chinese-style code.
And he was also focused on urban development.
Very much so. He encouraged commerce, improved roads and river transport, which really helped the commercial city of Pang Long or Hanoi to boom.
And this is the era that really solidifies Confucianism as the orthodox political ideology.
It completely dominates the political and intellectual spheres. Buddhism is still popular among the people, of course, but it retreats. It loses that massive political patronage it had under the Li dynasty.
Unfortunately, that internal stability it dissolves in the 16th century. This leads to this period of internal splits and southern expansion.
The first split is with the Mac dynasty. But that conflict eventually just devolves into this messy power split during the later Lei Restoration. The Lei emperors become total figureheads.
And the real power is divided between the Trent lords in the north Ngai and the Nguyen lords in the south Trung.
And the sources show that the Nguyen clan's move south was deeply personal. It was about survival. Nguyen Hoang got himself the governorship of the far south frontier in 1545, specifically to escape purges being run by his powerful relative, Trinh Kim.
And that political exile is what starts the massive territorial expansion known as Nam Tien, the March to the South.
An expansion that dramatically pushed Vietnamese territory down the coast into what had been Cham and Khmer lands.
And this process is historically incredibly complex. It's often portrayed as this peaceful, inevitable migration, but the sources suggest there was significant resistance.
That's the heart of the debate. The expansion certainly involved wars and resistance from the Cham and other indigenous peoples. But post-1960 official historiography in North Vietnam systematically recast Nam Tam as a peaceful movement of Viet people into, quote, abandoned lands.
And what was the political need to sanitize that history?
Well, the Communist Party after 1960 was totally focused on national unity, on mobilizing the whole country against the U.S. and South Vietnam. A history of peaceful expansion was just politically more useful than acknowledging centuries of conflict with the very minority groups they were now trying to integrate into the modern state. It serves the project of forging a single, cohesive national story.
And this whole dynastic age finally ends in chaos with the Tay Son Revolution.
From 1771 to 1802, and this was a genuine populist uprising. It was led by three brothers, not related to the ruling Nguyen lords starting in Nguyen.
And the movement drew its strength from the oppressed.
Everyone, poor peasants, workers, persecuted Christians, ethnic minorities from the Central Highlands, Cham people, all of them united against the distant and oppressive Nguyen lords.
Their success was incredible. They annihilated the ruling Nguyen clan, forcing the sole survivor, Nguyen Phu Con, to flee to Siam.
And this, in turn, triggers these massive external interventions. First, the Siamese intervene to support Nguyen, and they're defeated. Then the lay emperor, trying to regain power, asks for outside help, which gets him exiled and gives the Qing dynasty in China the perfect excuse to intervene.
And the king sent this enormous army, maybe up to 200,000 troops, under the pretext of defending their tributary state.
A final, desperate attempt by China to reassert control. And it was decisively defeated by the Tay Son army, led by the brilliant Nguyen Huc at the Battle of Nguyen.
But the Tay Son, despite that initial populist appeal, they started oppressing the Chinese-Vietnamese merchant communities.
Right. They often saw them as an internal threat. And that internal shift created the opening for the exiled Nguyen An to stage his comeback. He used support from that persecuted merchant class who saw him as a liberator, along with external aid, to finally defeat the fractured Tay Son forces and establish the very last dynasty of Vietnam, the Nguyen dynasty, in 1802.
Okay, so now we move into part 3, colonialism, ideological warfare, and division, which will take us from 1858 all the way up to the end of the Vietnam War in 1975.
The Nguyen dynasty, from 1802 to 1945, started their rule very aware of their precarious position between China and the rising European powers.
It's interesting, while the king recognized the name Vietnam, the Nguyen dynasty often used the grander term "a Vietnam" in foreign relations.
With all states except China, it was a subtle way of asserting a greater status on the world stage.
And internally, they tried to solidify control by doubling down on Confucian cultural politics, especially under Emperor Minh.
Minh Mang's reign was really marked by this heavy policy of sinicization aimed at ethnic minorities. He actually referred to the Vietnamese people as Han Han, or Han people, to distinguish them from Khmers and Chams.
So it was an explicit policy of acculturation?
Very explicit. His goal, he said, was for these other groups to be subconsciously dissipated and infected by Han customs. You really saw the ethnic Vietnamese as the inheritors of a superior Han cultural legacy.
And this powerful, conservative, inward-looking state was the perfect target for the emerging European empires.
The first shadows fall in 1858, the Franco-Spanish bombardment of An. It was driven by Napoleon III, who was looking to protect Catholic missionaries and, project European power.
And the assault was relentless, leading to the capture of Saigon in 1859.
But the resistance was instantaneous and heroic, even against a technologically superior enemy.
You're thinking of the sinking of the French brig L'Espérance in the Battle of Nhat Tao Canal in 1861.
It's a classic story of Vietnamese defiance. Nguyen Trung led local naval forces, ambushed the French ship on the Vam Co River, and sank it. It was a clear, if localized, victory that sent a message that the Vietnamese would not submit easily.
Despite these pockets of resistance, though, the French were just relentless in their colonial project. They captured Hanoi twice, in 1873 and again in 1882.
What's fascinating, though, is that even their victories came at a high cost. Both of their top commanders, Francis Garnier and Henri Rivière, were killed in action fighting the Black Flag Army.
A pirate force hired by the Vietnamese mandarins.
Exactly. It shows that while the dynasty was crumbling, local resistance was still inflicting a serious toll on the invaders.
But the dynastic rule formally ends with the Treaty of Hue in 1883. That's the official surrender.
And by October 1887, French Indochina is formalized. The territory is carved up into a colony, Cochin China, and two protectorates, Annam and Tonkin, with Cambodia and Laos added 6 years later.
The colonial period then breeds this fierce Vietnamese nationalism in the early 20th century. But that nationalism was split between two profoundly different ideas about how to achieve independence.
On one side, you had the radical armed movement, the Ongu movement, led by Phan Boi Chau. He believed in armed revolt and looked to Japan as a model, sending students there to learn modern skills to fight the French.
And on the other side, you had the path of peaceful reform, the Duitan movement, led by Phan Chau Trinh,
who advocated for a completely nonviolent struggle. His focus was on modernization, mass education, and fostering tolerance. He famously set up the Tonkin Free School in 1907.
What's really interesting is that even with their different tactics, both groups had a fundamental critique of the old system. The sources say that the nationalists pointed out the moral decay of the monarchy itself.
Right, they called it an autocratic regime that prioritized the king's personal desires over the public interest, over Duncan popular rights.
That rejection of the monarchy was a huge step toward creating a modern national identity.
And a modern identity needed a modern language, which is why the Romanized Quoc Num script became so vital during this time.
The Patriots saw that the complex Chinese characters in Che Nom were just too cumbersome for rapid learning. Quoc No was the key to quick literacy, to modernization, to mass political education. It was a tool of liberation.
And it's into this landscape of, ideological ferment and linguistic change that Ho Chi Minh emerges. And his path was really shaped by the failure of peaceful petitioning.
He goes to the Paris peace talks in 1919 seeking independence for Vietnam and is just completely ignored.
And that profound disillusionment fuels his radicalization, his communist zeal. It leads him to join the French Communist Party and go study in Soviet Russia.
He returns in 1941, already a figure of immense reputation after decades abroad as a Comintern agent, and his arrival coincides with the disruption of World War II.
Which turns out to be the pivotal moment. Japan forces its way into Vietnam in 1940, displacing the French. When Japan surrenders in August 1945, there's a total political vacuum.
And Ho Chi Minh steps right in. He leads the Provisional National Liberation Committee and declares the unilateral independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV, in September 1945.
But France, even in the chaos of the post-war world, was determined to get its jewel in the crown back. And that leads directly to the First Indochina War.
From 1946 to 1954, and the war began with just shocking violence. France's naval bombardment of Haiphong kills over 6,000 people.
And that prompts the DRV to attack the French in Hanoi, kicking off a full-scale total war. The Viet Minh, led by General Nguyen Giap, relied on superior knowledge of the terrain and these really sophisticated guerrilla tactics.
Hit-and-run ambushes, sabotaging supply lines.
And avoiding the large set-piece battles they knew they couldn't win conventionally. They chose when and where to fight always.
And their success was critically enabled by powerful allies.
Absolutely. China provided not just training and political advisors to remold the state along communist lines, but also massive material aid like Soviet-built GAZ-51 trucks to manage logistics.
So seeing that an outright military victory was impossible, France tried what's called the Bo Dai solution.
They bring back the former Emperor Bo Nai in 1947 to lead the state of Vietnam, which they set up in Saigon in 1949. The hope was that this nominally independent, non-communist state would peel support away from the Viet Minh.
But that effort failed dramatically with the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
Forcing the Geneva Conference. The Accords temporarily divided Vietnam into a communist north, the DRV, and a non-communist south. And crucially, nationwide unification elections were planned for 1956.
But they never happened.
Never happened. And this is where U.S. fears just completely overruled the agreement. Washington was convinced that Ho Chi Minh, who is immensely popular across the whole country, would easily win any free election.
So the U.S. focused on building up a bulwark against communism in the South.
And this established the two fundamentally opposed states that would fight the Vietnam War, or the Second Indochina War, from 1955 to 1975.
The South, the Republic of Vietnam, or RVN, was established by Nguyen Ngoc Dien in October 1955. But his legitimacy was, let's say, compromised from the very start.
To put it mildly, his referendum on the future of the state was heavily rigged. Diem claimed 98% of the vote, including a fantastical 133% turnout in Saigon.
And he immediately used that mandate to eliminate all political opposition,
Purging powerful armed religious groups like the Cao Ai and the Hoa. Meanwhile, the North, backed by the Soviets and China, officially sanctioned a protracted armed struggle in 1959.
They escalated the infiltration of weapons and fighters down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the National Liberation Front, the NLF, or Viet Cong, was formed in 1960 to conduct the insurgency in the South.
U.S. involvement just accelerates dramatically.
Right.
By 63, you have 16,000 advisory forces on the ground. But Diem's autocratic rule, especially his brutal handling of the Buddhist crisis, was eroding confidence, both locally and in Washington.
That erosion led directly to the November 1963 coup, which was tacitly approved by the U.S. Diem was executed. The U.S. hoped a military government would be more effective, but the instability just got worse.
The war escalates into full-blown U.S. intervention after the August 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, an incident which was, as we later found out, largely misrepresented or exaggerated.
But it gave President Johnson the political cover he needed. He got the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress, which he used as authorization to launch Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign, starting in February 1965. The U.S. was now fully in.
And the sources really show the unique nature of this conflict. It was defined by these small unit engagements, with the PAVN and VC initiating 90% of the large firefights. They retained the strategic initiative throughout the war.
They were masters of blending in with villagers, using those extensive underground tunnel networks as bases, hospitals, supply depots.
And the American forces responded with overwhelming firepower. Search and destroy operations. But they often proved strategically useless and caused immense human displacement. Operation Masher displaced 125,000 people, but the VC and PAVN just returned 4 months later. The whole strategy of measuring success by body count was a failure.
And the PAV and VC side was sustained by this immense geopolitical supply chain.
China supplied 320,000 military support troops for logistics and engineering, freeing up PAVN combat units, plus about $180 million a year in arms. The Soviet Union provided the sophisticated stuff, like surface-to-air missiles.
But the real turning point of the war wasn't military. It was psychological and political.
The Tet Offensive, January 1968.
Militarily, Tet was a disaster for the NLF and the PAVN. They suffered catastrophic casualties.
But it was a profound defeat in the idea battle space. The sheer scale of the coordinated attacks hitting over 100 targets at once, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, it shattered the credibility of the White House.
I mean, news anchor Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, openly questioned if the war was winnable.
The American public, who had been told victory was just around the corner, suddenly saw that the enemy could launch massive attacks across the entire country. That psychological defeat directly led to President Johnson abandoning his re-election bid. It was the beginning of the end for the U.S.
Richard Nixon takes over, implements Vietnamization in '69. The idea was to draw down U.S. troops while building up the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN.
But while he was withdrawing troops, he was also secretly expanding the war. He initiated these covert, sustained bombing campaigns against supply lines in Laos and Cambodia.
A deception that was revealed with the release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, confirming the government had been lying about the war's scope. At that point, the U.S. was just looking for an exit with some dignity.
The Paris Peace Accords are signed in January 1973, formally ending direct U.S. military involvement. But critically, North Vietnamese forces were allowed to remain in the South. When Congress then cut military aid to the South, the defense just collapsed.
The North launched the final Ho Chi Minh campaign. Saigon fell on April 30th, 1975. The last South Vietnamese president, Nguyen Van Minh, surrendered unconditionally. After 3 decades of war, Vietnam was finally unified under communist rule.
And now we enter our final part, Part 4. Unification and the socialist-oriented market economy, which tracks Vietnam's journey from the ashes of war to its current economic status.
The immediate post-war years were defined by just immense internal challenges. Vietnam formally reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam on July 6, 1976.
And they quickly merged the Northern and Southern Communist parties to create the Single Communist Party of Vietnam, the CPV. The initial phase was marked by this attempt to impose a pure socialist ideology on the capitalist South.
which led directly to an economic crisis, a massive policy failure. The party launched these class struggle attacks on the educated middle and upper classes in the South.
Viewing them as ideological threats, not as essential assets for Reconstruction. Their skills in commerce and technical fields were vital, but they were marginalized, targeted.
And that, combined with the attempt to communize the South's vibrant economy, was just catastrophic. The third five-year plan failed miserably by 1985.
Then came the devastating 1985 price reform. It was an attempt to introduce market prices while maintaining state control, and it resulted in runaway inflation that soared to over 700%. Vietnam became one of the poorest countries in the world.
And on top of that, they were totally isolated internationally. Their involvement in the Cambodian-Vietnamese War and the Sino-Vietnamese War triggered a U.S.-led embargo.
They were completely reliant on the rapidly weakening Soviet bloc. That economic desperation created the internal pressure for radical change. And the death of the hardline General Secretary Lê Dôn in July 1986 opened the door for the Doi Moi reforms.
The reformist wing, led by people like Trung and then Nguyen Van Linh, took over. But the idea of reform wasn't instantaneous. The sources show there were quiet experiments happening even earlier.
Right. In the early 80s, cooperative leaders in the North were quietly allowed to rent out fields to members during the winter. They were essentially testing the limits of quasi-private economic activity under a socialist cover.
The core of OIMI, or renovation, was establishing the socialist-oriented market economy,
which required this really complex ideological pivot inside the CPV. They had to justify using capitalist tools without abandoning communism.
So how did they do it? They rewrote their own revolutionary platform.
They did. They stated that the People's Democratic Revolution is actually a new type capitalist democratic revolution. The logic was that Vietnam had to pass through a phase of market economics, a controlled capitalism, to build the material foundation for true socialism, and thus skip the need for a bloody civil war between workers and capitalists.
But they put a critical constraint on it. The state-owned sector had to remain the dominant sector.
That was the firewall. In the party's view, maintaining the dominance of the state sector was necessary to preserve the socialist character of the economy and guarantee the CPV's perpetual right to rule. They were embracing markets, but only under the firm ideological supervision of the state.
To make this work, though, Vietnam desperately needed international reintegration,
which began when they ended their involvement in Cambodia in 1989, and crucially, repaid their arrears to the IMF in 1993. That opened the door to the World Bank and other international lending.
And the scale of that external support was immediate and massive. IDA lending went from $325 million in '94 to over $500 million in '96, focusing heavily on critical infrastructure roads, power, irrigation, and social services.
The result has been a miraculous economic success. GDP grew almost 5 times between 1990 and 2000. The economy averaged 7.6% growth for over a decade. It transformed Vietnam from one of the poorest nations to near middle-income status in a single generation.
And the most important statistic for the people is poverty reduction. Poverty rates just plummeted from 58% down to 16% between 1994 and 2007. It's a staggering success story.
Much of this modern growth is fueled by attracting massive foreign direct investment, or FDI. The current development model is all about factory-driven economic growth,
creating specialized industrial zones to give foreign capitalists special privileges, infrastructure like the Haiphong port and new highways. It's all geared toward supporting these foreign-backed industrial zones. The CPV itself is called the private economy the most important driving force.
But this rapid economic liberalization came with significant social and political dynamics, especially in the health system.
The reforms introduced market dynamics into healthcare, which immediately created problems of equity.
Right. Economic growth increased overall wealth, but it also amplified income and regional disparities. Health costs for patients skyrocketed because of official fees and unofficial payments, leading to huge disparities and a dramatic decrease in the use of public facilities by the poor.
So finally, let's look at that crucial intersection of market openness and political control, censorship and public discourse.
Gamu did initiate a relaxation of state censorship, but the limits are absolute, especially when criticism points too high up the party ladder.
The perfect example is the 2006 PMU-18 scandal. What happened there?
PMU-18 was a huge corruption case in the Ministry of Transport. At first, journalistic exposés were very successful, leading to the resignation of the transport minister. But the sources confirmed that when the reporting started to imply that corruption reached the very highest levels of the Communist Party's Politburo, the entire investigation was abruptly shut down.
That's the hard limit then. You can expose corruption, but not if it threatens the legitimacy of the CPV's power structure itself.
Exactly. And the consequence was severe. The very journalists and police informants who broke the story were later charged and convicted of various offenses. It was a clear signal that the party's survival overrides freedom of the press.
Despite those limits, the internet has forced a change. Since 2006, the rise of the blogosphere has created an active online public sphere.
Vietnamese citizens widely use blogs as a source for alternative viewpoints outside of official government media. Activist bloggers cover controversial topics like human rights, and some have even questioned the legitimacy of one-party rule.
And the state has responded with increasingly sophisticated and harsh censorship tactics.
Deploying malware, using verbal and physical abuse against activists, and outright imprisonment. In 2021, for example, 5 journalists were sentenced to prison for spreading anti-state content. The message is crystal clear. Economic freedom is welcome, but any political challenge to the CPV's authority is strictly forbidden and will be severely punished.
What an incredible journey. I mean, if you synthesize this entire 40,000-year history, from Bronze Age chiefdoms to the modern market economy, the central narrative has to be this perpetual struggle for self-definition.
It absolutely is. Whether it was against Chinese imperial powers, French colonial rulers, American intervention, or even that devastating internal economic collapse before Doi Moi, Vietnam's history is this relentless exercise in defining and defending its own sovereignty and its own survival.
And that relentless determination brings us to our final provocative thought. Today, Vietnam has found itself in this remarkably complex strategic position. It relies heavily on China for manufacturing and trade, but it simultaneously balances that dependence by pursuing deeper security and political relationships with the West.
A very tricky diplomatic balancing act. It requires extraordinary political skill.
So if we look back across the entire history we've just talked about, what strategic precedent does this modern policy follow most closely? What historical lesson is Vietnam applying to its modern geopolitical reality?
It is the masterful pragmatism that was established by the Trinh Dynasty back in the 13th century. After they repelled the Yuan invasions, they maintained peace and their own internal sovereignty through that strategy of emperor at home, king abroad. They offered outward deference to their powerful neighbor Kublai Khan's China while maintaining absolute internal control, refusing to ever pay true homage or surrender their autonomy. Modern Vietnam is applying that ancient successful model, maximizing economic necessity with the giants next door while fiercely guarding its political independence through diversified international relationships. That art of strategic non-submission, I think, is the true enduring legacy of Vietnamese statecraft.